killing ends a young life, leaving nothing but questions.
We not only have a whodunit, we have a who is?
We need to find out who his friends are.
An unknown victim and no reliable witnesses.
Hey, somebody has to listen to me!
She's had a few drinks. Could she be wrong? Absolutely.
I said I don't know anything.
The brutality of the murder leads Lieutenant Joe Kenda down a shadowy path to a painful truth.
He was the father figure to them.
This is as serious as it gets. The movies and television cannot and do not portray violent death. They all think they do, and viewers all think that that is what it looks like, and it ain't.
1 a.m. It's the night before New Year's Eve. Folks in Colorado Springs are gearing up for end-of-the-year celebrations that will usher in a new decade. At a convenience store on the east side of town,
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
clerk Ricky Holden struggles with an endless stream of holiday revelers.
You got a party?
New Year's was always a crazy time of the year.
You've got people who, frankly, start to pre-party days before the event. It makes it difficult, I think, for anybody who has to deal with the public.
One sec. Hello? Yeah. Can't do it right now.
Ricky was taking care of customers in the store, and as he was ringing up the sale, he hears the thud coming from outside.
Scream.
He runs out to check. There's a man laying on the ground in a large pool of blood.
Meanwhile, at police headquarters, Lieutenant Joe Kenda and his fellow officers are dealing with their own strain of holiday chaos.
For some reason, people find it very important to fire weapons into the air to celebrate the new year.
I didn't get my phone call.
Nobody's trying to hurt anybody. It's just a matter of celebration in their mind.
Have a seat.
Hey, man, come on.
I didn't do anything.
So all of the substations around the city, they're filled with drunks, filled with arrests. Profanity is the order of the day.
Anything happens to my 22, I'm gonna personally sue your ass.
Sure. You want my badge number?
Yeah.
Inventory that for me.
So we wind up with confiscated weapons being stacked into the building out of the hands of the drunk. Everything is really, really out of control.
Central booking.
That's when Kenda gets the call about an incident at a convenience store on the east side.
Lieutenant. It's Kenda. Yeah, I know where that is. I'll be right there. You can reach my radio if you need me. Yes.
When I hear this is an address on Fountain Boulevard, I immediately know this is going to be very serious. This is a high crime area at the time. We've had as many as half a dozen homicides in that area in less than a month.
Kenda arrives to find a crowd of onlookers demanding to know what's happening.
Would you put me out at 149?
The neighbors, they're not impressed by our presence.
How you doing?
Good, how are you doing, sir?
Okay, so what do we got?
Oh, Lieutenant, the victim's being transported to St. Francis. He doesn't look good.
What are his injuries?
Not sure, he's just covered in blood.
When somebody's hair is matted in blood and their face is covered in blood, it is very difficult to tell what has happened to them. Has he been shot? Has he been stabbed? Has he been run over?
But the unknown nature of the injuries isn't the only mystery surrounding the victim.
Do you know who he is?
No, no ID on him.
Thank you.
Apparently he wasn't carrying any identification on his person. We not only have a whodunit, we have a who is. You can't have anything more difficult than a circumstance where you don't even know who the victim is, let alone who hurt him in the manner in which he's been hurt.
Kenda begins by taking a look at where his John Doe was found.
There's a large amount of blood in the parking lot in front of the business.
The wide swath of blood-covered asphalt gives Kenda his first clue.
When you find bleeding at a crime scene, very often it's drainage, meaning it is pouring from a still body by the force of gravity. This is not the case here. There's obvious smearing and movement going on in the blood. So there is a struggle going on between the person who's doing the bleeding and the person who produced the blood.
Did the victim sustain a gunshot and then fight back? Kenda asks responding officers if they've recovered any additional physical evidence.
They say they searched the area for expended casings and didn't find any. And I get closer to where the blood is, and I see pieces of this wood laying there covered in blood.
As Kenda continues surveying the scene, he receives some grim news from the hospital.
St. Francis called. Our victim, DOA.
Thank you.
So now we have a homicide. All we're certain of is he's dead.
Still looking for answers, Kenda turns his attention to store clerk Ricky Holden.
How you doing? I'm Lieutenant Kenda. How you doing, sir?
He's observant, he's cooperative, he's intelligent.
Did you see the victim earlier? Oh, yeah.
He says he notices a Hispanic male in his middle 20s on the payphone outside the building.
I stopped paying attention to the guy because I had these 3 customers in line. It made me a little nervous.
Can you tell me about that?
Hey, man, I'm about to put it together all right. Hey, get a pack of smokes, too, please. What? All right, so we pack of smokes, please, the hard pack.
2 black males, early 20s, and they're obviously friends, and they're laughing and pushing and shoving each other and basically having a good time. With them is a teenage girl.
Wrap it up, dog. Pick it up and wrap it up, please.
What happened next?
They left, and I took the next customer in line.
Ricky tells Kenda that just moments after the 2 men left the store, he heard a strange noise, followed by what sounded like a woman screaming.
And he looks up in time to see a small white car leave the parking lot at a high rate of speed. He doesn't see who's in it, but he assumes it's the people that just left, the 2 black guys and the white girl.
Would you recognize anyone if you saw him again?
Oh, yeah. Took a real good look at him.
Did you happen to see the license number?
Couldn't see it, but I'm pretty sure the car was like gray or whitish.
Having information that is a light-colored car is pretty meaningless. What distinguishes it from every other car? It's better than nothing, I suppose, but it's pretty close to nothing.
No, I appreciate the help.
Thankfully, it's not long before Kenda gets some much-needed help from the most unlikely of individuals.
As the investigation is progressing, a lady walks up, kind of stumbling up to the crime scene, and it's obvious she's been drinking, celebrating the New Year's.
Hey, somebody has to listen to me.
We look at her and we say, hey, it's a crime scene and it doesn't include you, so hit it. See you later. Then she says something that gets my attention.
I saw the plate, the license plate. Get off of me.
Hey, Mike, send her through. What license plate?
I saw the white car that was speeding off with the people in it. I tried to tell these dudes over here, they don't want to believe me.
And she gives us a license plate number with the last 3 digits.
The last 3 digits were 114.
Now that is huge.
You sure that's what it was?
Yes.
We find a light-colored car with the right kind of people in it that are close to that combination of numbers. We're in business. We're investigating a murder at a convenience store with more unknowns than there are knowns. We have an unknown victim, we have an unknown cause of death, and we have no way of determining where we can find the only people of interest we're aware of.
But just when it seems Kenda has hit a dead end,
Let me through.
a woman comes forward with a partial license plate number.
Is our witness a mathematical genius? Probably not.
The last 3 digits were 114.
She's had a few drinks. She appears to be a little spacey even when she's not drinking, but she says 114.
Thank you. You head back to the tape. How many APB put out on that? Could you do that for me?
Just can you get an APB on a...
Then, a call comes into the convenience store. Curiously, the caller asks to speak with the officer in charge of the investigation.
Hello?
Hey, Lieutenant. There's a woman on the phone in here. May have some information you might want to talk to.
All right, I'll take it. Thanks.
So when I pick up the phone, I give my name, and can I help you?
It's Lieutenant Kenda.
And this woman says her name is Yvonne Wallace.
Yes, hello, sir. My name is Yvonne. I got a voicemail from this convenience store.
She says she's got a boyfriend named Miguel Mendez, and he's 25 years old, and he called her from that area and needed a ride home.
According to Yvonne, Miguel left her a message saying he'd find a ride and not to worry. But he never made it home.
She explains that she drove around to see if she could find him, and she saw the police at the convenience store, and she got very frightened.
Kenda has a feeling he's just identified his victim.
We asked her to describe Miguel to us on the phone.
He's 5'10", brown hair. He was wearing a gray shirt with a black hoodie and jeans.
And she provides us with a description of the clothing, body size, and appearance of our victim. So I said, Yvonne, someone's been hurt here at this store. I just said hurt. And I want you to meet me at St. Francis Hospital emergency room in 15 minutes. Can you do that?
Yeah, I can do that. 15 minutes.
I'm going to have her look at this body and tell me if it's Miguel Mendez. That's not a nice thing to do. Nothing about what I do is nice.
But before Yvonne arrives at the hospital, Kenda and his men hope to solve the mystery of what killed her boyfriend Miguel.
How you doing? We're investigating this murder. Do you have a cause of death yet?
Multiple skull fractures.
Are there any bullet wounds or knife wounds or anything like that?
No. Looks like he was beaten pretty badly, though. Broken ribs, bruises all over.
Thank you.
I look at his head. It's obvious he's been struck and beaten with a blunt object. As I look closer, I see splinters of wood in his hair.
The splinters remind Kenda of something he saw at the crime scene.
I've seen a lot of murder weapons. I've never seen firewood used as one. It is a weapon of opportunity. Somebody is so enraged that beating on this person with feet and fists isn't enough. So he picks up something and uses it in the course of the assault. Not because it's firewood, but because it's there.
The savage nature of the attack against Miguel gives Kenda a clue about the identity of his killer.
Somebody was pretty upset at this person. You don't normally see this kind of activity amongst strangers. We need to find out who he was with, who his friends are.
But first, Kenda must break the news of Miguel's death to his girlfriend, Yvonne.
I look at this body. I clean his face to make him look slightly more presentable, and trust me, it was only slightly.
person that was hurt earlier tonight, unfortunately, has passed away. And that's who we have right here.
I said, you're about to see something you've never seen. And I'm sorry I have to put you through this, but I'm afraid I must.
Is that Miguel?
I said, is that Miguel?
Is that Miguel?
Yes, she screams.
Nurse? Hey, nurse in here, please.
I call a nurse, and we need to have her looked at. But I have my answer. I wish I could just leave and let them give her a sedative, but I can't do that. My job is to find who killed Miguel Mendez.
After giving Yvonne a few minutes to collect herself,
excuse me, you mind if we have a moment?
Kenda and his men ask if they can talk to her about Miguel.
I said, Yvonne, you have to help me. Miguel would want you to do that for him.
Can you tell me a little bit about Miguel?
According to Yvonne, Miguel was 25 years old and worked in construction as a cement finisher. Yvonne had been his common-law wife for more than 3 years.
Yvonne and Miguel didn't have children together, but she had 5 children, and he was the father figure to them. And they were attached to him. So there's a huge emotional loss for her and for them.
There you go!
Do you know anything about what happened tonight?
No, we were at the bar and drinking, and everything was fine. Bring it in, Laura.
She had been out earlier that evening with Mr. Mendez and a person she identified as Hector and a friend of hers. And they had had several drinks together.
I think I'm gonna go home, okay?
And after a while, her and her friend decided that they were going to leave, and her boyfriend decided that he would stay with Hector and have a couple more drinks. He would be home later.
So we are just beginning this case, but now we know who he was with on the night he died.
Kenda wonders, did Hector and Miguel get into a drunken argument that escalated into murder?
No, look, man, I done told you too many times, bro.
And this Hector, you know where we can find him?
Yeah.
Now, if we assume this is a rage killing, it is likely that an acquaintance of his is responsible.
You, Miguel. You too, man.
What better choice than the man was last seen with him?
Yeah, I'm walking. Miguel? I'm walking, that's it.
Hector, I am in your future. You just don't know it yet. We're investigating the death of 25-year-old Miguel Mendez, who's been savagely beaten to death in the front of this convenience store. Patrol is out looking for the suspect vehicle when my interest has been piqued by another suspect. We find the last person he was seen alive with was a friend named Hector Rodriguez. We have determined where Hector lives, and we're about to confront him.
How you doing? I'm Lieutenant Kenda from the Colorado Springs Police Department. I'm looking for a Hector Rodriguez. I understand he lives here.
He's my son. Come here.
He lets us in, and he gets Hector.
Hector!
And Hector is 22 years old.
What's going on? I need to talk to you about Miguel Mendez. Do you know him?
Hector says he worked with Miguel Mendez at a concrete company, and they would carpool together because Hector had a car, and Miguel never had a car.
When was the last time you saw him?
Last night, we went out for some beers after work.
Hector says that he went out in the evening And then when Yvonne and her friend left, he and Miguel were still sitting in the bar.
We stayed, had a couple more beers. One more.
Then after a while, Hector decided that he was going to go over to another bar, the Yukon Tavern, to have some cocktails with another friend of his.
Y'all have a safe ride home.
Thank you. You too. Have a good Happy New Year.
Miguel didn't want to go to the Yukon Tavern, so they parted company. Miguel walked away in one direction, he walked away in the other.
What time did you leave him?
About 10?
What time did you get home?
11:30.
All right, wait here for a second. I want to talk to your dad.
If Hector is telling the truth, it would place him back at home more than an hour before Miguel's murder. But Kenda's not about to take Hector's statement on face value.
Excuse me, sir. Can I ask you a few questions? Yeah. Were you here last night when your son got home?
Yes.
Do you remember what time that was?
Well, Johnny Carson was on. It was his monologue, so that'd be 11:45.
It appears Hector Rodriguez is telling the truth.
Is Miguel okay, or is he in any kind of trouble?
I'm afraid I have some bad news. Miguel was killed last night.
So now Hector goes from being a possible person of interest to no one at all. And we are back to the beginning.
Now, detectives' only remaining lead is the white car seen leaving the scene of the crime.
As the investigation is going on, information had been put out to patrol officers giving a description of the possible suspect vehicle as well as a partial license plate number.
10 a.m. Officer Dave Fisher is out on routine patrol in southeast Colorado Springs when he hears an APB over his radio.
They aired that a small white vehicle was seen leaving the scene, and they gave a license plate number.
This officer is aware we're looking for this light-colored car. He is aware that it contains at least one black male, maybe two, and a white female.
As if on cue, Officer Fisher spots a white car approaching from the opposite direction.
One has to remember something about police officers. They are trained observers. They read people extremely well. He sees a black male, and he sees on his face what is referred to in the cop world as the look. He sees a fear factor in this guy's eyes. Suspicious.
I made the U-turn and then observed the license plate number, and it was 114.
Possibly spotted the suspect vehicle.
And the red lights come on in that police car. And he stops.
When an officer approaches a suspect vehicle of any type of violent crime, certainly their senses are heightened. You don't know the state of mind of the person or persons that are in the vehicle.
Keep your hands on the steering wheel. Put your hands on the steering wheel, man. Put your hands on the dash. Slowly reach down. Let me see some kind of identification.
Look, I don't have any ID, officer.
I don't either.
We don't have any with us, really.
Go ahead and step out of the car for me. Slowly.
What's this
Keep
about?
your hands where I can see them.
You need to tell me what this is about?
What's that on your jacket?
It was at that time I noticed wet spots on his shirt, and I asked him what that was on his shirt, and he said it was taco sauce, but it didn't look like taco sauce to me.
Dispatch to Kenda.
Go for Kenda.
A car matching the description from the APB was pulled over. One black male and one white female.
Well, now, my whole attitude changes.
10-4, I'm on the way. Kenda out.
I was feeling sorry for myself after we left Hector's house that now we're all of a sudden back in gear and driving forward.
you doing?
How you doing? So what do we got?
Stop this white car up here. It's got some blood on his shirt. Or do you want to talk to her?
Though it's his first concrete lead, Kenda knows he'll need more than a partial license plate and what looks like a blood stain to officially declare these two people suspects.
Well, it's New Year's Day weekend. Who knows? You get blood in you a lot of ways. You could have been in 3 other fights, and not the one we're concerned about. I want to make certain we got the right people here.
To do that, Kenda reaches out to the crime's initial eyewitness.
Ricky Holden told us when we interviewed him at the convenience store that he would be able to identify these people if he ever saw them again. Well, I'm going to give him that opportunity.
Half an hour later, Kenda returns with the man who seemingly holds the key to solving the case.
I've got Ricky sitting inside the car with the windows up. The girl's in one car, the guy's in another car. And this is make or break. He's either going to get excited and say that's them, or he's going to say it isn't. It isn't going to be maybe. We're investigating the beating death of a young construction worker. We believe we have 2 suspects stopped, and I'm conducting a field identification by Ricky Holden, our best witness.
All right, take your time, Ricky.
I don't need to take my time. That's them. That's definitely them.
There it is. He said the other guy's not with him, but that's the girl and that's the guy, period.
You gotta wrap it up, man. We're in a hurry, all right?
That's as good as it gets when it comes down to witness identification.
I'll pull him out of the car and cuff him.
The positive ID gives Kenda enough probable cause to bring the 2 suspects into custody.
What's your name?
Bienvenido, but my friends call me Ben.
Let's get the blood on your shirt.
Look, man, I don't know nothing about that, man. That was all Anthony.
Who's Anthony?
One of my friends.
Well, you have great taste in friends, my boy. Let's go to my office. We will talk about this some more.
Let's take a ride down to the station. You can tell me about Anthony. Bring her too.
So we get our man into an interrogation room. He is Ben Callwood. He's 19 years old.
Why don't you tell me what happened last night, Ben?
I was at this party. That's kind of cool.
Ben Callwood tells Kenda that he and his fiancée Jenny had been at a pre-New Year's beer bash, and they left with Anthony to pick up some snacks.
Hey, baby. I'm on the corner of Chelton Road.
I appreciate it. Let's go, baby. We walk out to the car. All of a sudden, I can't see Anthony. I turn around and I see him arguing with some Mexican dude over there on the side.
You know what I am? Stop!
He sees Anthony pick up a bundle of firewood from in front of the store and strike this guy with it in the head.
Hey, come on in.
Guys!
He says he goes over there and he's going to break them up. And he says that's where he got the blood on him when he tried to separate them.
I ran out to go stop Anthony. I was like, look, man, we gotta go and everything. That's how I got the blood on my jacket.
Ben Callwood's story gels with the physical evidence. But Kenda isn't sure whether Ben is telling the truth or trying to pin the crime on his friend.
Once again, I'm innocent. It isn't me. It's him. He wants to paint himself as a peacemaker, and you know it's not true.
Stay put. I'll be back.
Kenda decides to let Ben Callwood sweat it out in the interrogation room and turns his attention instead to Ben's fiancée, Jenny.
Have a seat.
Ben didn't do anything.
Okay, let's just back up a second. So, Ben's your fiance?
Yes, he is.
How old are you?
16.
She says that she's a junior in high school. And you think, what are you doing running around with these guys?
So what happened at the store?
Anthony started beating on the guy with a piece of wood. He was like a crazy person.
What's Ben doing with this?
Ben was trying to stop Anthony.
Now she keeps insisting Ben didn't do anything, but she's lying. She's protecting her intended. And it's pretty obvious that she is. And I said, stop.
Jenny, at this point, you're not considered a suspect. But if you don't tell me the truth, we can charge you with accessory after the fact. And you will go to prison. Now, you want to tell me what really happened?
Whether or not you get involved in this up to your pretty little neck or whether you don't is going to depend on your answer to my question. Now, what did Ben do?
I don't know why you don't believe me. Is the Mexican guy saying that Ben was beating on him too or something? I mean...
What'd you say?
Suddenly, it dawns on Kenda that Jenny doesn't understand the gravity of the situation.
You do realize that this guy's dead.
They killed him?
And her eyes get huge. And she looked at me and said, you're kidding.
They beat that man to death.
I said, no, I don't kid about that, dear. This is a murder. I know Anthony was fighting Miguel Mendez. I know that Ben was probably participating in it as well. However, his fiancée, Jenny, has been refusing to admit it.
You do realize this guy's dead. They beat that man to death.
That young man was DOA at St. Francis Hospital from the beating provided by your two companions. Now you understand why we're here discussing this. This is as serious as it gets. Tell me what you saw.
Well, I guess Ben did beat the guy a little bit.
All right, well, that's close enough for me. For charging purpose, he's a participant in a beating death.
All right, you're free to go for now.
I've released the girl to the custody of her parents. We're not charging her with an offense. Ben, I'm keeping.
Sir, stand up, please. You are under arrest.
Ben Callwood is placed under arrest for the murder of Miguel Mendez.
I didn't murder anybody.
But Kenda's other suspect, Anthony Scott, is still at large. Later that day, a call comes into the precinct with a promising lead.
It's Lieutenant Kenda.
The caller's name is Rose Garcia. She says she heard about the murder on the news, and on the night in question, she was at a house party.
That's crazy, bro.
She's at the party and everybody's drinking and people are coming and going. But she specifically remembers two guys laughing.
Hey, right? You had to make sure he was down. Bang! Right there, right in front of me.
That's what I saw. That's what I saw.
And saying they just really screwed a guy up at a convenience store in a parking lot.
Boom! I saw that. Boom! I saw that.
Homeboy's nose exploded. I was like, what?
He saw that.
Rose says that she talks to them and their names are Ben and Anthony. Well, isn't that swell? That's exactly who I'm looking for now.
Kenda heads straight to the home of the party's hostess, Lisa Schmidt.
We think Lisa's going to be able to tell us if Anthony's invited. She probably knows where he lives. So we're knocking on Lisa's door. Nobody's answering. Finally, a male answers the door.
Yes.
He's shielding his eyes from the light.
Lieutenant Kenda from the Colorado Springs Police Department. And you are?
Tyrone.
Tyrone, we're looking for an Anthony Scott. Do you know him?
Nah, I ain't never heard of him.
Tyrone! Oh, that's my boyfriend, but I own the place.
So this female approaches behind him and says that this is her apartment, and that's her boyfriend, Tyrone.
You had a party here last night?
Yes, sir.
We have reason to believe that Anthony Scott was at that party?
There were a lot of people coming in and out. It was a party.
She's giving the standard bullshit answer to the question. You don't get anywhere being nice to people. You get somewhere with pressure.
Right now, Anthony's wanted for murder. If you know something about it that you're not telling me, we can charge you with harboring a fugitive. And that's a felony. If you've got something to say, you better say it right now.
All of a sudden, here comes our man, Tyrone.
You know, some of my friends do call me Anthony.
You're Anthony Scott?
Yes, sir.
Well, isn't that a shock? Huh, Tyrone?
Put your hands on the wall.
Over here.
Hey, I did nothing. Come on. I did nothing.
I did nothing.
Kenda has his prime suspect in cuffs, but if there's any hope of making felony charges stick, he needs physical evidence tying Anthony Scott to the murder.
Once the investigators determined that they were, in fact, talking with Anthony and Lisa, they were then able to conduct a search of that apartment.
The officers go in and start their search.
Hey, Lieutenant.
What do you got?
And within a matter of 5 minutes, they say, come in here and look at this.
It's a man's sweatshirt, covered in blood.
When you attack someone with a blood instrument, the first blow produces blood, the second blow disperses it, and every blow thereafter, all this blood belongs to Miguel Mendez because he hit him many, many times.
Let me guess. You're painting a barn, right?
Man, I know my rights. I want a lawyer.
Okay, that's fine. You have your right to a counsel.
Sure.
You know what, Anthony? We really don't need to talk to you. We've got the evidence we need.
Even without a confession, Kenda has enough to piece together the tragedy that led to Miguel's death.
So, how did this all come to be what it became? Miguel Mendez is out with his friends.
We'll get more, babe. We'll get more. Stop being cheap.
They are drinking.
Is that way? Store is that way? No, it's that way. Oh, that's all.
Then everybody sort of leaves it.
I'll see you tomorrow.
All right, buddy.
Take care.
So he's alone.
Hey, baby. I'm calling to see if you were home.
Running, okay?
So there he is, standing on the payphone in exactly the wrong place on planet Earth.
Love you. Bye.
At precisely the wrong moment.
Hey, y'all, can I get a ride down the road?
No, man, sorry.
Come on, man. It's freezing out here. Hey, man. Hey, bro, can I get a ride down the road?
No.
Come on, man.
So now Miguel is annoyed that the answer is no, and he tells the guy, who knows what he says.
Man, you then.
And Anthony's reply is...
What did you just say?
I said, you.
On the street, you diss someone. You show them disrespect.
Come here.
I'm
Go ahead,
good,
don't worry about him, man.
It's not to be tolerated by street people. That's important to them. It's not important to anybody else on the planet, but it's important to them.
You know what I am?
Bro.
Anthony loses it.
Come back.
You can almost predict assaults in which alcohol was involved because Alcohol can really lead to violence in a very explosive way.
He grabs the first thing he can get his hands on, which is a bundle of firewood, and he whales this guy in the head with it. Miguel, at this point, goes down. And so, Ben, what's Ben doing? He joins in, like in the frenzy of this attack. They are kicking him in the head, kicking him in the chest, punching him on the ground. They get back in the car and they run. Miguel never moves. He can't move. He's busy dying.
Ultimately, Anthony Scott pleads guilty to murder, accepting a sentence of 24 years to life. Ben Callwood pleads guilty to being an accessory and is given 8 years.
Stranger killings are very unusual and the toughest cases to resolve. It is so tragic because it's so meaningless. We have an entire family of victims, not just one man. A guy wants a ride. That's a death penalty offense, asking for a ride? I guess it depends on who you ask.
The night Florida stopped sleeping began with a phone that kept ringing in an empty kitchen, its shrill sound bouncing off tiled walls, unanswered, unnoticed, while somewhere beyond the glow of streetlights a woman vanished without a scream, without a witness, without a single clean explanation. It was the spring of 1993, the air already heavy with humidity, the kind that sticks to skin and memory alike, and in a quiet coastal town where people measured danger by hurricanes and not by their neighbors, a front door stood half open as if someone had stepped out for only a moment and never came back. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, just a purse left on the counter, keys beside it, dinner cooling on the stove. The first headline would come hours later, blunt and unfinished, echoing the shock that followed. Local woman missing, circumstances unclear. Police arrived to a house that looked paused in mid-breath. A calendar still marked the day. A radio humming low in the background. Family photos lining the hallway, smiling faces frozen in earlier decades, unaware of what was about to become a word whispered behind hands and spoken carefully in public. Officers moved room to room, methodical, cautious, waiting for something to feel wrong enough to explain the silence, but the house resisted confession. Outside, neighbors gathered in clusters, nightclothes pulled on hastily, eyes sharp with curiosity and fear, already rehearsing the moment they would later say they knew something was off, that they felt it in their bones. No one heard a struggle. No one saw a car. No one could agree on when exactly she was last seen. Time fractured almost immediately. By morning the name was everywhere. On local radio. On hastily printed flyers taped to telephone poles. On the lips of parents pulling their children a little closer as they walked them to school. She was not a drifter, not someone easy to lose. She had roots here. Family. A routine. A life built on predictable rhythms that now felt like lies. Detectives traced her final hours through receipts and second-hand recollections, each detail sharp on its own, useless when placed next to the others. She bought groceries in the late afternoon. She waved to a neighbor. She spoke to a relative on the phone, her voice normal, untroubled. And then nothing. The gap yawned wide, swallowing certainty. The investigation moved fast at first, driven by urgency and the unspoken fear that time itself was the enemy. Search teams combed nearby woods, canals, empty lots baked hard by the Florida sun. Divers slipped into dark water where visibility dropped to zero within inches, hands sweeping through silt and weeds, hoping for an answer no one wanted. Dogs tracked scents that dissolved into nothing at the edge of pavement. Each day ended the same way, with exhausted officers shaking their heads and reporters rewriting the same paragraph with different words. No body, no suspect, no motive anyone could agree on. The town learned a new phrase, one that carried a chill no matter how casually it was spoken. Cold case, even though it wasn't cold yet, not really, not while hope still flickered. Attention turned inward, as it always does. Family members were questioned gently at first, then again and again their grief measured and catalogued, their statements compared for microscopic inconsistencies. A husband who appeared composed was called suspicious. A sibling who cried too hard was called unstable. Old arguments were dragged into the light, inflated, reshaped into theories that sounded convincing in the abstract and collapsed under scrutiny. Detectives followed each lead until it led nowhere, until the trail dissolved into rumor or resentment. The house was searched again, more thoroughly this time, walls tapped, drains inspected, crawl spaces opened. Nothing spoke. Nothing accused. As days stretched into weeks, the story shifted. The initial shock settled into something heavier, a low-grade anxiety that seeped into daily life. Locks clicked a little louder at night. Porch lights stayed on. Strangers were watched more closely. The case files grew thicker, but clarity remained elusive. A witness came forward claiming to have seen a car parked oddly on the street that night, but couldn't describe it beyond dark. Another insisted they heard voices raised in anger, but only after seeing the news, only after replaying the night in their mind until memory blurred with imagination. Tips flooded in, each one promising a breakthrough, most of them dissolving on contact with reality. Then came the theories, bold and reckless, born in the absence of facts. Crime of passion, a random abduction, a planned disappearance. Some whispered about debts, about secrets buried deep in the family history, about things that didn't belong in police reports but thrived in conversations held late at night. Detectives listened, took notes, followed up where they could, aware that sometimes the truth arrives wearing the costume of gossip. But every door they opened led to another hallway, another dead end. The case refused to cohere. Months passed. The flyers faded in the sun, paper curling, ink bleeding. Media attention drifted elsewhere, pulled by fresher tragedies, louder scandals. The town learned how to live with the unanswered question sitting at its center, heavy and unavoidable. For the family, time did not heal. It sharpened. Holidays arrived like insults. Birthdays went uncelebrated. Each knock at the door carried the same impossible hope. Investigators rotated off the case, replaced by others who had to learn the details secondhand, through notes and transcripts that could never fully capture the urgency of those first days. By the end of the year, the word cold was no longer premature. Fit. The case slipped into a filing cabinet, still open in theory, dormant in practice. But dormancy is not the same as death. Somewhere in those pages were facts that hadn't yet found the right order, truths waiting for the right pressure to force them into the light. The town felt it, even if it couldn't articulate it. A sense that the story was unfinished, that the silence was doing more than hiding absence. It was hiding something else, something closer, something that had been present from the very beginning. Years would pass before anyone dared say it out loud, before the idea hardened into suspicion and then into resolve. But even in those early days, as the house stood quiet and the phone finally stopped ringing, the foundation was already cracking. Not in the streets or the woods or the dark water beyond the docks, but within the walls of a family that knew more than it was ready to admit, carrying a secret that would outlast the headlines and turn a missing person into a lingering wound the town could never quite close. Time did what it always does to an open wound in a small town. It covered it without healing it, layering routine over fear until people could almost pretend the absence had a shape they understood. By 1994, the name was no longer leading the evening news, but it still lived in the margins, in the way conversations dipped when certain streets were mentioned, in the way the house sat unchanged, curtains drawn, lawn trimmed by someone who refused to let it look abandoned. Detectives came back to the file with fresh eyes and stale leads, rereading reports written in the heat of urgency, noticing how many times the same phrases appeared, how often certainty dissolved into qualifiers. No sign of forced entry. Last seen at approximately. Believed to be. Words that sounded professional, precise, and yet explained nothing. They began reconstructing the timeline again, hour by hour, minute by minute, chasing the idea that if they could tighten the gap, something would fall out. Phone records were reviewed with more sophistication than was available the year before. Each incoming and outgoing call mapped, durations measured, silences noted. One call stood out not because of what was said, no one knew that, but because of when it ended. Too early. Too abruptly. It was to a family member, a conversation that should have been mundane, comforting even, yet it ended like a door slammed shut. The person on the other end claimed nothing unusual, insisted the line went dead. The explanation was logged, accepted, and quietly circled in red. Neighbors were re-interviewed, this time separately. Their stories compared not just for contradictions but for emotional texture. Who hesitated? Who volunteered details unprompted? Who seemed eager to help, too eager, filling the silence with anecdotes that pulled attention away from the night itself. One neighbor remembered a light on in the house later than usual. Another corrected them, said it was off. A third wasn't sure anymore. Memory had begun to rot, and detectives knew it. Knew that every passing month turned recollection into reconstruction, shaped by news coverage and whispered theories. Still, they pressed on because sometimes what people change says more than what they forget. A new lead emerged from an unlikely place. A routine audit that flagged a financial discrepancy small enough to be invisible at first glance. An account tied to the missing woman showed activity after the night she vanished. Not much. A withdrawal here. Payment there. Nothing that screamed fraud. But enough to raise the question that always lurks in these cases. Who benefits from silence? The transactions traced back to a familiar name, explained away as housekeeping, as confusion, as an error corrected later. Detectives noted how often paperwork was used as a shield, how easily complexity could masquerade as innocence. The family closed ranks as pressure mounted, grief hardening into defensiveness. Interviews grew tense. Lawyers appeared. Questions that once seemed reasonable were now treated as accusations. The detectives felt it, the shift from cooperation to containment, the subtle way doors closed and voices flattened. Family photos were removed from walls before search warrants arrived, as if memory itself had become evidence. Rumors spread that the investigation was tearing people apart, that old grudges were resurfacing, that secrets once dismissed as irrelevant were being re-examined under a harsher light. In a town that prized privacy, the idea that answers might lie behind familiar faces was more disturbing than any theory involving a stranger. Outside the family, the community wrestled with its own reflection. Vigil crowds grew smaller but more intense, faces lined with fatigue and resolve. Some demanded answers loudly, accusing law enforcement of incompetence, of letting time erase responsibility. Others argued for patience, for trust, for the belief that justice moves slowly but surely. Letters to the editor filled local papers, some calling for renewed searches, others urging everyone to let go, to accept that some questions do not want answers. The tension was palpable, a low hum beneath everyday life, reminding everyone that unresolved violence does not stay contained. Detectives followed the money trail as far as it would go, cross-referencing it with travel records, with work schedules, with the unglamorous data that rarely makes headlines but often breaks cases. They found patterns that didn't quite line up, gaps that required explanation. Each time they asked, the answers came quickly, too quickly, rehearsed in a way that suggested prior discussion. One investigator noted it in a margin. Responses feel synchronized. Another wrote, possible coaching. These notes did not make arrests, did not bring closure, but they accumulated, forming a quiet indictment of normalcy. As the second year passed, technology advanced just enough to breathe new life into old evidence. Items collected from the house were re-examined, fibers reclassified, samples tested with methods unavailable during the frantic early days. The results were inconclusive, frustratingly so, but they eliminated possibilities, narrowing the field. No unknown DNA. No clear sign of an intruder. The absence itself began to speak, suggesting not chaos but control, not panic but planning. The idea took hold among investigators that whatever happened that night did not leave the house in disarray because it didn't need to. It had been expected, prepared for, folded into routine. Late one evening, an anonymous tip came in, the kind that arrives without fanfare and leaves investigators staring at each other in silence. The caller didn't offer proof, didn't provide a smoking gun. They offered context. A story about a family argument years earlier, about threats made in anger and later dismissed as words spoken too hot to matter. The caller claimed those words had never cooled, that they had calcified into something dangerous. The tip was vague enough to be useless in court, specific enough to be impossible to ignore. It was logged, cross-referenced, filed under names already too familiar. The case slipped again, not into obscurity but into a kind of suspended animation, active on paper, dormant in action. Detectives rotated, promotions and retirements thinning the ranks of those who remembered the first night vividly. The file grew heavier, its spine cracked, its pages yellowing. Yet something had shifted. The narrative was no longer about where she went. It was about why she never left. The focus narrowed, tightened, until the circle of suspicion closed around a place that had once been considered sacred, untouchable by the brutality of crime. Years later, when people spoke about that period, they described it as living under a question mark, a punctuation mark that refused to resolve into a sentence. The town moved forward, built new houses, welcomed new families who learned the story secondhand, as legend more than reality. But for those who were there, who watched the investigation turn inward, the memory remained sharp. They remembered the moment they realized the danger hadn't come from outside, that the cold case was not about a missing woman alone, but about the quiet, corrosive power of secrets kept too long, waiting for the right moment to surface and demand their price. By the mid-1990s, the case had acquired a second life, one quieter and more insidious than the first. It no longer erupted into the town with sirens and searchlights. It lingered instead, threaded through conversations that stopped when someone new entered the room, through glances exchanged across grocery aisles, through the subtle recalibration of trust. Investigators who inherited the file felt the weight of it immediately. The sense that they were not just reading about a disappearance but stepping into a long unresolved argument between truth and denial. The reports were thick with facts, yet thin on certainty, a mosaic of moments that refused to align. One detective, newer, less burdened by the emotional residue of the early days, began asking the kind of questions veterans sometimes avoid. Not where did she go, but what changed right before she vanished. He charted behavior, not events, mapping stressors that rarely make headlines. Financial strain, family obligations, unresolved conflicts that fester quietly. The picture that emerged was subtle but unsettling. There were signs of pressure, of expectations closing in. Small things, missed appointments, a sudden reluctance to speak freely on the phone, a comment overheard at a family gathering that had been dismissed as humor at the time but now read like a warning. He revisited interviews with relatives, not listening for lies but for patterns, who framed their memories around themselves, who emphasized their helpfulness, who spoke of the missing woman in the past tense long before anyone else dared to. One statement buried deep in a transcript stood out. A family member had said, almost casually, "She wouldn't have left like that." At the time it sounded like confidence, reassurance. Years later it sounded like certainty of a different kind. The detective underlined it, then circled it, then wrote a single word beside it: how. Another development pushed the case forward in an unexpected direction. A former acquaintance, someone who had moved away shortly after the disappearance, returned to town for unrelated reasons and found themselves drawn back into the orbit of the story. They approached police hesitantly, as if unsure whether memory itself could be incriminating. What they offered was not evidence but atmosphere. Recollections of tense family gatherings, of conversations that stopped abruptly when the missing woman entered the room, of a feeling that something was always being negotiated behind closed doors. It was the kind of testimony that defense attorneys love to dismantle, subjective and unverifiable. But investigators listened carefully. Atmosphere, after all, often precedes action. The detective team began to suspect that the timeline everyone had accepted might be wrong. Not in hours but in meaning. What if the disappearance was not a sudden rupture but the final step in a process already underway? They examined the days leading up to that night with new urgency. A cancelled plan here. An uncharacteristic purchase there. A visit to a relative that lasted longer than expected. Each detail alone was innocent. Together they suggested preparation. Not escape but conclusion. They returned again to the house, this time not as a crime scene but as a stage. Where would conversations have happened? Which rooms offered privacy? Which walls carried sound? Investigators stood in silence, imagining voices lowered, choices weighed. The absence of chaos took on a new significance. This was not a place where something went wrong. It was a place where something was decided. The notion chilled even the most seasoned officers. Crimes committed in panic leave mess. Crimes committed with resolve leave order. Outside the investigation, the family's public posture shifted subtly. They spoke less to media, citing fatigue, privacy, the need to move on. When they did speak, their words were polished, careful, almost rehearsed. Appeals for information were vague, stripped of urgency. Observers noted how often statements emphasized closure rather than answers, healing rather than truth. It was not incriminating, but it was telling. People who still hope tend to sound different from people who have already accepted an outcome, even if they refuse to name it. In 1997, a minor incident reignited attention. Construction workers uncovered human remains in a wooded area miles from town. For a brief, agonizing period, the possibility of resolution hovered close. Detectives coordinated with forensic teams. The town held its breath. The remains were eventually identified as belonging to someone else, a tragedy unrelated yet cruelly timed. The disappointment was palpable, but it also sharpened resolve within the investigative unit. The false alarm underscored a truth they had been circling for years. If the missing woman's body were to be found, it would not be by chance. It would be because someone decided it could be found. That realization reframed everything. Investigators began to think in terms of leverage rather than discovery. Who might crack under pressure? Who might talk if they believed someone else was about to? Old relationships were re-examined, alliances mapped. The detective who had started this new approach proposed a theory that initially met resistance. That more than one family member knew what happened, and that silence was being enforced not by loyalty alone but by mutual vulnerability. Secrets layered over secrets, each one binding the others tighter. This theory explained things that had long puzzled them. The synchronized answers, the defensive posture, the way grief seemed to manifest as control rather than collapse. It also suggested a way forward, one that would take time and patience rather than raids and arrests. They began quietly, recontacting individuals separately, spacing interviews months apart, altering questions slightly to test consistency. They watched for microreactions, for moments when rehearsed narratives frayed at the edges. One interview, conducted late in the evening, produced a flicker of something close to fear. When asked about a seemingly insignificant detail from the night of the disappearance, the interviewee paused longer than necessary, eyes darting away, breath catching. The answer that followed contradicted an earlier statement, but only by a shade. Enough to notice. Enough to note. The detective did not challenge it then. He let it pass, logged it, and moved on. Pressure, he knew, works best when it accumulates unseen. As the decade closed, the case remained officially unsolved, but unofficially it had entered a new phase. It was no longer about searching fields or waterways. It was about waiting. Waiting for relationships to fracture. For guilt to surface in unexpected ways. For someone to decide that the cost of silence had finally exceeded the cost of truth. The town felt the shift even if it couldn't articulate it. A sense that the story was not fading but condensing, drawing inward toward a point of inevitable release. In the background of everyday life, anniversaries continued to pass, each one reopening wounds that never quite closed. Candles were lit. Names were spoken. And beneath the rituals, beneath the shared expressions of loss, something else endured, something unspoken and unresolved, pressing against the walls of a family that had learned to live with a lie, unaware that time, relentless and patient, was already positioning itself to expose what they had hidden for far too long. By the early 2000s, the cold case had aged into something paradoxical, both familiar and volatile, like a fault line everyone knew was there but no one could see. New detectives inherited old suspicions, and the language of the file had changed. It no longer asked what happened, it asked who was still pretending they didn't know. The town had grown, strip malls replacing orange groves, new families moving into houses with no memory of the night everything stopped. Yet the case remained, passed hand to hand within the department, its gravity unchanged. The investigative strategy shifted again, quieter than before, almost surgical. Instead of interviews, there were conversations. Instead of pressure, there was patience. Detectives attended community events, funerals, weddings, places where people relaxed just enough to forget they were being observed. They listened more than they spoke. They learned which names still made people uncomfortable, which topics caused voices to drop. One name in particular continued to produce a subtle tightening of expressions, A flicker that lasted less than a second but appeared often enough to be unmistakable. Family once again hovered at the center. A break came not from evidence but from erosion. Years of silence had taken their toll. Relationships strained under the weight of what couldn't be said. One relative filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences that friends privately described as fear and resentment. Another moved out of state abruptly, selling property at a loss, leaving behind a house emptied too quickly, as if distance itself could erase implication. Detectives noted these changes, mapped them against the calendar, searching for catalysts. Silence, they suspected, was no longer unanimous. A routine traffic stop provided a glimpse into the psychological residue of the crime. An officer pulled over a vehicle for a minor violation. The driver, connected distantly to the family, reacted with disproportionate panic, hands shaking, voice cracking, insisting on explanations that hadn't been requested. There was nothing illegal in the car. No charges were filed. But the incident was reported up the chain, flagged for its intensity. Fear, investigators noted, does not dissipate with time if it has not been resolved. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were consulted, not to file charges but to evaluate scenarios. What could be proven? What would require corroboration? What would collapse under cross-examination? The conclusion was sobering. Without a body, without a confession, the case remained fragile. Circumstantial evidence could point. Patterns could suggest. But certainty, the kind that survives a courtroom, remained just out of reach. The advice was clear: build leverage. Find the weak point. Someone would talk eventually. They always do. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly, disguised as compassion. A family member fell ill, seriously, the kind of illness that strips away pretense and forces reckoning. Detectives were careful, ethical, aware of the line they could not cross. They waited. When the individual reached out, not to confess but to reminisce, officers listened. The conversation drifted, memories surfacing unguarded. Then came a sentence that landed with quiet force. We all did what we thought was best. The plural lingered. It was not an admission. It was something else, something closer to justification. The statement was documented, dissected, replayed in briefing rooms. Who was we? Best for whom? The illness worsened. Time compressed. Detectives sensed a closing window and adjusted their approach. They arranged a formal interview, gentle but precise, revisiting familiar ground from a new angle. The interviewee grew tired, words losing their polish. Details slipped. A location mentioned that had never appeared in earlier statements. A time frame adjusted without explanation. It wasn't enough to act on, but it was enough to confirm what investigators had suspected for years. The story had been curated. As whispers of renewed investigative activity spread, the family reacted. Lawyers reappeared. Media statements were issued preemptively, reaffirming cooperation while condemning speculation. The tone was defensive, almost hostile, a sharp contrast to the earlier years of guarded openness. Observers noticed how often the statements emphasized unity, how frequently they rejected the idea of internal conflict. The insistence itself raised questions. Unity, investigators knew, is often a performance. The town felt the shift. Old residents recognized it immediately. The subtle tightening of atmosphere that precedes revelation. New residents sensed it without understanding why. An undercurrent of tension that didn't match the sunny facades. Online forums revived the story, dissecting it with the confidence of hindsight, proposing theories that ranged from insightful to absurd. Detectives monitored quietly, aware that public speculation can both obscure and expose. Sometimes the wrong theory provokes the right reaction. In 2005, an overlooked piece of physical evidence was revisited, not because it was new but because technology had caught up. The item itself was mundane, something easily dismissed in the chaos of the early investigation. Reanalysis did not produce a miracle, no clear fingerprint or DNA match. But it did produce confirmation that the object had been moved, repositioned after the fact. Staged. The implication was chilling. Someone had not only acted but edited the scene. That word, staged, became central. Investigators reframed the case around it, asking not how the disappearance occurred, but how it was meant to be perceived. The absence of struggle. The items left behind. The timeline constructed to suggest normalcy until the very end. This was not improvisation. It was design. And design implies forethought, implies discussion, implies more than one mind engaged in the act. Pressure mounted unevenly. Some family members withdrew further, retreating into silence. Others became erratic, contacting investigators with information that led nowhere, as if attempting to discharge guilt without consequences. One left a voicemail late at night, rambling, emotional, stopping short of anything actionable. Another sent an anonymous letter that described feelings rather than facts, fear rather than events. Each contact was a crack, small but significant. The facade was weakening. As the case entered its second decade, the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Investigators spoke privately about the weight of it, about the frustration of standing so close to truth without being able to touch it. Yet they also sensed momentum, slow but undeniable. Silence, once solid, was now brittle. The family secret, whatever its exact contours, had begun to corrode from within. The town waited, knowingly or not, for the moment when restraint would finally fail, when loyalty would give way to survival, when someone would decide that carrying the truth alone was heavier than facing it together. The cold case was no longer frozen. It was thawing drip by drip, each sound echoing louder in the quiet, signaling that what had been buried for years was starting, inevitably, to rise. By the time the calendar crept toward the end of the decade, the case had become less an investigation and more a presence, something that sat in rooms with people, listening, waiting. Detectives felt it when they reviewed the file late at night, the way certain names still seemed to vibrate on the page, charged with meaning. The strategy now was endurance. Let time do what interrogations could not. Let guilt age. Let fear mature into desperation. Because fear, when left alone too long, seeks release. That release almost came from the most unlikely place. A family gathering meant to mark a milestone. A birthday that should have been ordinary. Neighbors later recalled raised voices. A door slammed hard enough to rattle windows. Someone called police, reported a domestic disturbance, then called back to cancel, insisting everything was fine. Officers noted it anyway. They always did. What mattered was not the noise but the timing. It came days after investigators had quietly recontacted several relatives, asking the same questions they had asked years earlier, changing nothing but the order. The ripple effect was immediate. Silence had been disturbed. Inside the family, alliances shifted. Old loyalties strained under the weight of implication. One member began distancing themselves, skipping gatherings, avoiding phone calls. Another grew more controlling, insisting on unity, on sticking to the story, on remembering things the right way. Friends noticed the change. Conversations grew tense, peppered with warnings about outsiders, about betrayal. It was the language of people who believe the danger is no longer hypothetical. Detectives capitalized carefully. They requested informal interviews, framed as updates, clarifications, routine housekeeping. One relative arrived visibly agitated, hands clenched, eyes darting to the door. When asked about the night in question, they offered details unprompted, filling space, correcting themselves mid-sentence. The detective let the silence stretch, a tool refined over decades. In that silence something slipped, a reference to an action that had never been documented. A phrase that implied presence where none had been acknowledged before. The moment passed quickly, but it was there, recorded, replayed later until its significance became undeniable. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. Prosecutors reiterated their position. Suspicion was not proof. Patterns were not verdicts. The case required a fracture, a single undeniable break in the narrative. Investigators began to ask themselves a harder question. What would finally force someone to choose truth over protection? The answer, they suspected, was not justice but self-preservation. That answer arrived in stages. First, a financial dispute erupted within the family, bitter and public, exposing resentments long buried. Accusations flew. Lawyers got involved. Documents were filed that contradicted earlier statements made under oath in unrelated matters. Detectives watched closely as the family's united front splintered into factions, each one convinced the others were the real threat. Trust eroded rapidly. People talked more not to police, but to anyone who would listen, venting frustrations. revising history in ways that revealed more than they intended. Then came the illness. Another one. Different person. Different circumstances. The kind of diagnosis that forces people to consider what they will leave behind, what stories will survive them. Investigators received word through intermediaries that someone was thinking about talking, testing the idea in whispers before daring to speak it aloud. Meetings were proposed, postponed, proposed again. Fear wrestled with relief. The idea of confession hovered, terrifying and tempting. When the meeting finally happened, it was anticlimactic on the surface. No tears. No dramatic admissions. Just a tired person sitting across from detectives, answering questions slowly, carefully, as if each word cost something. They did not confess. They circled. They spoke of atmosphere, of pressure, of decisions made under strain. They described a night heavy with arguments, with ultimatums, with a sense that something had to change before morning. They stopped short of naming actions, but they named intentions. An intention investigators knew was the bridge to accountability. The interview ended without arrests, without headlines. But when detectives stepped outside, they felt it. The shift. The case had crossed an invisible line. What had once been speculation now had texture, weight. The narrative was no longer abstract. It had faces, voices, motives that made sense in a bleak human way. The idea of an outsider, once convenient, now felt almost absurd. Word spread within the family that someone had talked, though no one knew exactly what had been said. Paranoia followed. Phones went unanswered. Messages were deleted. Meetings were canceled. One individual abruptly retained new legal counsel, a move that did not go unnoticed. Another attempted to preemptively reframe the story, contacting media with vague statements about misunderstandings and the danger of assumptions. The effort backfired, drawing attention back to a case many believed was drifting toward resolution. Behind closed doors, investigators began assembling the story as it likely unfolded, not as a single explosive act, but as a convergence of choices. A confrontation that escalated. A line crossed that could not be uncrossed. Panic, yes, but contained panic, disciplined by familiarity and trust. A decision made not by one person alone, but reinforced by others who believed protecting the family was the same as protecting themselves. The absence of a body no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a consequence. The town sensed it too. The way people spoke about the case changed. Less speculation. More certainty, even if unspoken. Longtime residents began saying things like, "We'll know soon," without explaining how they knew. The air felt charged, as if waiting for a storm that had been forecast for years but never quite arrived. The cold case was no longer a relic. It was active, volatile, pressing against the present. As the year closed, detectives prepared for what they believed would be the decisive phase. They reviewed every interview, every note, every moment where the truth had nearly surfaced. They understood now that the secret had survived not because it was strong, but because it was shared. And shared secrets, once fractured, collapse quickly. All it would take was one person deciding they were done carrying it. One voice breaking the silence. And somewhere, in the spaces between fear and regret, that decision was already forming. The decisive phase did not announce itself with sirens or warrants. It crept in quietly, almost politely, the way truth often does when it has waited long enough. Detectives noticed it first in the tone of their calls. Voices that once sounded guarded now carried an edge of urgency. Questions were asked not about procedure but about protection. About what would happen if someone cooperated. About whether the past could be confronted without destroying what little remained of the present. These were not the questions of innocence. They were the questions of people preparing to choose sides. The first real crack came during a follow-up interview that was never meant to be dramatic. It was scheduled as a clarification, a chance to revisit earlier statements in light of new context. A phrase vague enough to be non-threatening. The interviewee arrived late, visibly exhausted, eyes rimmed red, movements stiff. They spoke slowly, carefully, as if weighing each sentence against an invisible ledger. When asked about the night of the disappearance, they repeated the familiar version, almost word for word. Then the detective asked a question that had never been asked before, simple and disarming. Who decided what to do next? The pause that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. Long enough for the recorder to capture the sound of breathing, uneven and shallow. The answer when it came was evasive, but it introduced something new. Not a name, but a structure. We talked, the person said. There were discussions. It was the clearest acknowledgement yet that the events of that night were not solitary, not impulsive. The detective nodded, made no move to challenge it, and gently asked who was present for those discussions. The interviewee's jaw tightened. The answer never came. But the damage was done. The singular narrative had finally fractured into a plural one. Word of the interview spread quickly within the family, distorted and amplified by fear. Accusations flew. Someone had gone too far. Someone had said too much. Long-standing resentments erupted into open conflict. Text messages were sent and unsent, voices raised behind closed doors. One relative packed a bag and left town for several days without explanation, an absence that did not go unnoticed by investigators. Another began drinking heavily, showing up at work late, snapping at coworkers, unraveling in ways that alarmed those who knew them best. Detectives tightened the net, careful not to spook their targets into complete silence. They scheduled more interviews, spaced strategically, creating the impression of momentum without revealing its direction. They revisited old witnesses, asking how family dynamics had changed over the years. People spoke more freely now. Time had dulled their fear of consequences, and loyalty had eroded under the weight of disillusionment. Friends described arguments they had once dismissed as normal, now reinterpreted as signs of something darker. They recalled warnings, half-joking comments about secrets that should stay buried. At the time it sounded like drama. Now it sounded like confession. Behind the scenes, prosecutors reviewed the evolving picture. The absence of a body still loomed large, but the narrative was strengthening. Conspiracy did not require physical remains if intent and action could be demonstrated. The law allowed for that. It always had. What it required was coherence, a story that could be told clearly and believed beyond a reasonable doubt. Investigators began assembling that story piece by piece, aligning statements, timelines, motives. The result was bleak but logical. A confrontation rooted in long-standing tension. An act meant to stop something from happening, not to cause harm that spiraled beyond control. A decision made in the aftermath that silence was the only way forward. The person at the center of that decision was not who the town expected. Not the loudest voice. Not the one most openly scrutinized. It was someone who had always appeared peripheral, supportive, the kind of figure people forget to question because they seem incapable of malice. Investigators had learned long ago that these were often the most dangerous assumptions. Quiet does not mean passive. Calm does not mean innocent. In this case, it meant calculated. The pressure finally became unbearable during a routine procedural moment. The delivery of a subpoena. It was not dramatic, not accusatory, just a piece of paper outlining obligations and deadlines. But it landed like a verdict. The recipient stared at it for a long time, hands trembling, before folding it carefully and placing it on a table. That night they did not sleep. By morning they were making calls, asking questions they had never dared to ask before. What if they told everything? What if they were already too late? The call to investigators came in the early afternoon, voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk," the caller said. "Off the record." "There is no such thing," the detective replied gently, but they agreed to meet. When they did, the atmosphere was heavy, charged with something close to relief. The person spoke in fragments at first, circling the truth like an animal testing unfamiliar ground. They described fear. They described loyalty twisted into obligation. They described a moment when saying no felt more dangerous than saying yes. The confession, when it finally came, was not explosive. It was quiet, devastating in its restraint. The details were precise, unembellished, as if rehearsed in private for years. Names were spoken. Actions were described. Locations were referenced with specificity that left no room for doubt. The missing woman had not vanished into the night. She had been confronted by people she trusted. The outcome was not intended, but once it occurred, the response was immediate and unified. Protect the family. Protect the image. Make it look like nothing happened. Investigators listened without interruption, aware that every word was reshaping a case nearly 3 decades old. They asked questions only to clarify, to anchor the narrative in verifiable reality. When the interview ended, the weight in the room shifted. The secret that had bound the family together for so long was finally exposed, and with it came a cascade of consequences no one could fully predict. As news of the cooperation spread through official channels, preparations began quietly. Warrants were drafted, strategies discussed. The town went about its business unaware that the ground beneath it was about to give way. For years, the cold case had been defined by absence. Now it was defined by presence, by names, by choices, by a truth that had waited patiently for fear to fail. And as the sun set on another ordinary day in Florida, detectives understood that the story was no longer about whether the mystery would be solved, but about how the community would absorb the revelation that the danger had never been out there, lurking in the dark. It had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, sustained by love, fear, and the terrible power of a family secret finally brought into the light. The arrests did not come all at once. They arrived like aftershocks, staggered, deliberate, each one confirming that the ground had truly shifted. Detectives understood the optics, the risk of turning a long-awaited resolution into a spectacle. They moved with restraint, serving warrants quietly, knocking on doors that had not been forced open in decades, reading rights to people who had spent years convincing themselves that day would never come. The town woke to rumors before it woke to facts, whispers racing ahead of confirmation, names circulating in low voices before appearing in print. The first person taken into custody did not resist. They dressed carefully, as if for an appointment, hands steady as they were cuffed. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, stunned not by the sight of police cars but by who stepped into them. This was someone they knew, someone they had greeted politely, trusted casually, never imagined as part of something so dark. The image shattered assumptions in real time. The story was no longer abstract. It had a face. As news broke, the language changed instantly. Cold case became solved case. Missing became killed. Allegedly gave way to according to court documents. Headlines echoed the same phrase again and again, struggling to contain the scope of what had been revealed. Family secret. The words landed with a peculiar weight, suggesting intimacy alongside betrayal, protection alongside destruction. The town recoiled, then leaned in, hungry for details it both feared and needed. Interrogations followed, some cooperative, others defiant. Those who had spoken earlier now had to repeat their accounts under oath, their words stripped of nuance and pinned to transcripts. Consistencies held. Discrepancies emerged. Investigators compared statements line by line, watching how some defendants clung to fragments of the old story, unwilling or unable to fully abandon it. Others collapsed under the weight of it, their composure dissolving as the reality of charges set in. Years of silence had not prepared them for scrutiny. It had only delayed it. The narrative, once fragile, now solidified. Prosecutors outlined a sequence of events that felt grimly inevitable. A confrontation fueled by long-standing tension. Accusations exchanged in a space meant to be safe. A moment where control was lost, followed by a rapid recalibration. Minds shifting from shock to strategy. What mattered most, the state argued, was not intent in the abstract but choice in the aftermath. The choice to conceal. The choice to coordinate. The choice to let a town search fields and waterways while the truth sat locked inside a family. Defense attorneys responded predictably, challenging credibility, attacking motives, emphasizing the absence of a body. They framed cooperation as self-preservation, not honesty, painted the confessions as coerced by fear of prosecution. The courtroom became a battleground of narratives, each side aware that public perception would shape as much as evidence. The judge reminded jurors to focus on facts, but facts in this case were inseparable from emotion. Outside the courthouse, the community grappled with its own reckoning. People replayed memories, wondering what they had missed, what they had ignored. Kind gestures were reinterpreted. Arguments overheard years earlier took on new meaning. Some felt betrayed. Others felt complicit, haunted by the possibility that they had sensed something wrong and chosen comfort over confrontation. Vigils were held again, this time not for hope but for acknowledgement, for the woman at the center of it all, whose absence had shaped decades of life. The family itself fractured beyond repair. Some members cut off contact entirely, unable to reconcile love with accountability. Others clung to one another fiercely, insisting that understanding the context mattered, that intentions had been misunderstood. Social media amplified every statement, every expression of sympathy or condemnation. There was no neutral ground left. Silence, once protective, now looked like evasion. As the trial approached, prosecutors made a calculated decision. They would not rely on a single confession. They would present the case as a mosaic, each piece reinforcing the others. Financial records, phone logs, statements collected years apart that now aligned with uncanny precision. Expert testimony explaining how crime scenes can be staged to suggest absence rather than violence. The story was methodical, stripped of drama, trusting that the truth presented plainly was damning enough. The defense countered with doubt. They reminded jurors that no remains had been recovered, that memories decay, that families under pressure say things they later regret. They pointed to the long gap between the crime and the charges, suggesting that time itself was the real culprit, blurring lines and inflating assumptions. It was a familiar strategy, one that has freed many defendants in cases like this. But something about this case resisted abstraction. The details were too specific, the coordination too precise. When testimony began, the courtroom listened to voices that had been silent for years. Some trembled. Some were flat, emotionless, as if the speaker had exhausted their capacity to feel. One witness described the weight of the secret, how it changed everything, how ordinary moments were poisoned by the knowledge of what had been done and what had been hidden. Another spoke of fear, of being told repeatedly that speaking up would destroy everyone, that silence was an act of love. The jury watched, absorbing not just the words but the cost of them. The most devastating moments were not graphic. They were banal. Descriptions of normal evenings, routine decisions, the way life continued immediately afterward. Groceries bought, bills paid, jokes made. The ordinariness underscored the horror more effectively than any detail of violence could have. It suggested a chilling adaptability, a capacity to compartmentalize that felt almost inhuman, yet painfully recognizable. As the trial unfolded, the town oscillated between vindication and grief. Closure, it turned out, was not a clean thing. It came tangled with regret, with questions about whether justice delayed had diminished justice itself. People debated sentences before verdicts were reached, argued about culpability, about who deserved forgiveness and who did not. The case had become a mirror, reflecting not just the actions of a few, but the values of a community forced to confront what it had lived alongside for years. And through it all, the woman at the center of the story remained present in a new way. Not as a missing person on a faded flyer, but as a life interrupted, a voice finally heard through the testimony of those who had tried to erase her. The cold case had been solved on paper, but its emotional reckoning was still unfolding, rippling outward, touching people who had never expected to be touched at all. As the court recessed one afternoon, jurors filing out in silence, detectives sat together exhausted, aware that the outcome was now beyond their control. They had carried the case as far as they could, through years of doubt and incremental progress. Whatever the verdict, the truth had been dragged into the light. The family secret no longer belonged to the family. It belonged to history, to a town that would never again tell the story the same way. The verdict did not arrive with the catharsis many had imagined. It came slowly, filtered through procedure and protocol, delivered in a courtroom heavy with anticipation and fatigue. Jurors filed back into their seats, faces unreadable, carrying weeks of testimony and decades of consequence. When the foreperson stood, the room held its breath, not in hope but in resignation to whatever reality was about to be confirmed. Guilty on some counts, not guilty on others. A legal mosaic that reflected the complexity of a crime built on shared decisions and fractured responsibility. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by silence so complete it felt intentional. No cheers, no cries, just the sound of pens scratching notes, of a judge's measured voice acknowledging the outcome. For some families it was justice. For others it was devastation. The law had spoken, but it had not spoken cleanly. It rarely does in cases like this. The absence of a body still loomed, an unfillable void that neither verdict nor sentence could fully address. Sentencing hearings reopened old wounds. Prosecutors spoke of accountability delayed but necessary, of the cost of a lie carried for years. Defense attorneys asked for mercy, invoking age, health, remorse, arguing that punishment now served no purpose beyond symbolism. Victim impact statements cut through the legal framing, raw and unfiltered, reminding everyone that time does not dilute loss. Each word landed heavily, expanding the emotional perimeter of the case beyond the defendants to the entire community. The judge weighed it all, balancing precedent against principle. When sentences were handed down, they felt both severe and insufficient, numbers attached to acts that had reshaped lives. Some defendants were led away in handcuffs, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on nothing. Others walked free, bound not by bars but by a public reckoning that would follow them indefinitely. Justice, it turned out, had multiple faces, none of them entirely satisfying. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, microphones thrust forward, the machinery of narrative hungry for resolution. Family members declined to speak, their silence now interpreted through a harsher lens. Commentators debated the outcome, parsing legal nuance, asking whether the system had done enough, whether it ever could. The phrase family secret was repeated so often it began to lose meaning. Yet its implications grew heavier with each use. In the weeks that followed, the town adjusted to a new normal. The case was no longer unfolding. It was settled, at least on paper. But resolution brought its own disquiet. People realized how much of their identity had been shaped by the mystery, how the unanswered question had provided a strange cohesion. Now that the answer existed, imperfect and painful, there was nothing left to project onto. The story had ended, and endings demand reckoning. Memorials took on a different tone. No longer vigils for the missing, they became acknowledgments of harm, spaces to speak her name without qualifiers. Friends shared memories that had been suppressed by uncertainty, stories that finally felt safe to tell. The woman was reclaimed not as a case, but as a person, her life disentangled from the crime that had defined her absence. It was a quiet reclamation, powerful in its restraint. For investigators, the aftermath was complicated. There was pride, yes, in seeing a case resolved after so many years. But there was also a lingering unease, a sense that some truths had slipped through the cracks of time. They reviewed the file one last time, noting how many moments could have changed the trajectory if recognized earlier. It was a professional reckoning as much as a personal one, a reminder that patience can reveal truth, but speed can sometimes save lives. The defendants began their own reckoning, each in isolation. Some expressed remorse publicly, statements crafted carefully, words chosen to mitigate rather than to confess. Others retreated into silence, their narratives collapsing inward now that they no longer needed to perform unity. The family, once bound by secrecy, existed now as fragments, each piece carrying a different version of the past, none of them whole. Years of speculation gave way to analysis. Academics wrote about the case, about how collective silence operates, how families can become ecosystems of denial. Law enforcement agencies cited it as a lesson in cold case persistence, in the value of waiting for the right moment rather than forcing the wrong one. The story spread beyond the town, beyond the state, becoming a reference point, a cautionary tale. Yet for those who had lived it, who had felt the tension settle into their bones, the case was never theoretical. It was personal. It lived in the way they trusted, in the way they listened, in the way they understood the fragility of appearances. They had learned that danger does not always arrive from outside, that harm can wear the face of familiarity and speak in the language of care. As time moved forward, as headlines faded and new stories claimed attention, the cold case settled into history. Not forgotten but contextualized. It became part of the town's collective memory, a chapter that could be referenced without flinching, though never without feeling. The secrecy that had once protected a few had damaged many. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not heal everything, but it changed the shape of the wound. And in that change there was a quiet, uneasy grace. The knowledge that silence, no matter how carefully maintained, is temporary. That secrets, especially those rooted in fear, eventually demand their due. The Florida 1993 cold case had ended not with a single revelation, but with an accumulation of choices finally laid bare. A reminder that time does not absolve, it only waits. The community learned to live with that lesson, carrying it forward into a future forever marked by what had been hidden, and by the cost of keeping it hidden for so long. Even after the verdicts and sentences, The case refused to stay contained within the boundaries of the courtroom. It lingered, reshaping conversations, altering relationships, pressing itself into the quiet moments when people thought the story was finally over. Closure, the word everyone reached for, proved slippery. What remained was understanding, and understanding carried its own weight. Appeals were filed almost immediately. Legal language returned to the headlines, dense and technical, threatening to reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar. Defense teams argued procedural errors, questioned the reliability of decades-old memories, insisted that justice delayed had become justice distorted. For the families of the convicted, the appeals were lifelines, threads of hope that the narrative might shift once more. For others, they felt like an attempt to rewrite history, to soften accountability through complexity. The town watched warily, exhausted by the possibility of reliving it all. Investigators were called back to testify again, this time about process rather than facts. They explained timelines, decision points, why certain leads had gone cold and why others had been revived. Under oath, they acknowledged missteps without surrendering conviction. It was a rare moment of transparency, one that exposed the human limits of policing alongside its perseverance. The truth had not emerged cleanly or quickly. It had been coaxed, pressured, waited for. That admission resonated beyond the case, feeding broader debates about cold cases and the patience they demand. Meanwhile, new information surfaced in unexpected ways. Not evidence, not enough to change verdicts, but context. Former friends spoke publicly for the first time, recounting interactions that now seemed ominous. Comment overheard years earlier. A sudden change in behavior dismissed at the time as stress. These recollections filled gaps in the emotional landscape of the crime, reinforcing the idea that what happened had been visible, if only faintly, long before it was proven. The town wrestled with an uncomfortable question. How many warnings had been missed because they were inconvenient to acknowledge? The woman at the center of it all began to reappear in the public imagination, no longer as a symbol of mystery but as a fully realized person. Local journalists published retrospectives that focused on her life rather than her death, interviewing classmates, co-workers, people who remembered her laughter, her habits, her plans. The shift mattered. It reclaimed agency from the crime itself, reframing the story as one about loss rather than intrigue. Her name, once synonymous with a case number, took on depth again. For the family members not charged, the aftermath was isolating. Guilt by association followed them relentlessly. Some changed their names. Others moved away. A few stayed, determined to face the judgment head-on, insisting that proximity to wrongdoing did not equal participation. Their lives became studies in ambiguity, reminders that accountability can ripple outward far beyond those formally accused. The community struggled to decide how much grace to extend, how to separate empathy from excuse. The house where it had begun became a point of fixation once more. Vacant for years, it stood as a physical anchor to the story, its walls saturated with memory. Debates erupted over what should be done with it. Sell it, demolish it, preserve it as a reminder. In the end, practicality won. The house was sold quietly, renovated, its interior stripped and rebuilt. New owners moved in, unaware at first of the weight embedded in the foundation. When they learned, as everyone eventually did, they chose to stay, arguing that places do not commit crimes, people do. It was a controversial decision, but it marked a turning point, an attempt to reclaim space from history. Academics and criminologists continued to dissect the case, focusing on the mechanics of collective silence. How fear aligns with loyalty. How narratives are reinforced through repetition. How ordinary people become capable of extraordinary concealment when they believe the alternative is worse. The Florida 1993 case became a reference point, cited in lectures and papers, its lessons abstracted and generalized. Yet abstraction never fully captured the human cost. The years spent waiting, the lives lived in the shadow of an unspoken truth. As appeals wound their way through the system, some convictions were upheld, others modified. Sentences were adjusted, years recalculated. Each ruling sparked fresh waves of reaction, reopening debates that many wished were settled. Justice revealed itself not as a destination but as a process, iterative and imperfect. The finality everyone craved remained elusive, replaced by a slow, grinding resolution that unfolded over time, rather than in a single moment. For the investigators who had stayed with the case the longest, retirement loomed. They gave final interviews, reflecting on the toll of carrying an unanswered question for so many years. None spoke of triumph. They spoke of responsibility, of the obligation to the victim, to the truth, to the idea that silence should never be mistaken for absence. The case, they said, had taught them humility. The truth does not always reveal itself to force. Sometimes it waits for weakness. In the town, children grew up hearing the story as something that happened before they were born. A cautionary tale woven into local lore. Parents told it carefully, emphasizing not the crime but the consequences of secrecy, the danger of choosing comfort over honesty. The narrative evolved, losing some of its sharpness, gaining a moral shape that made it easier to carry forward. And still, on certain nights, when the air hung heavy and the streets were quiet, people found themselves thinking about the unanswered parts. Where exactly she had been laid to rest. Whether the full truth had ever been spoken. Whether there were details that would die with those who knew them. These questions no longer demanded resolution. They hovered, reminders that even solved cases leave residue. Fragments that resist closure. The Florida 1993 cold case had moved beyond investigation and trial. It had become memory, lesson, warning. It had shown how time can both conceal and reveal, how truth can survive decades of suppression, emerging not in a blaze of certainty but in layers uneven and human. The story no longer belonged to the courts or the police. It belonged to everyone who had lived alongside it, shaped by it, and learned, too late or just in time, what silence can cost. By the time the appeals process slowed and the headlines finally thinned, the case had entered a quieter, more unsettling phase. The noise was gone, but the echo remained. People no longer argued about guilt or innocence in public spaces. Instead, they argued privately about meaning. What did it say about them, about the town, about the years they had lived alongside a truth they did not yet know how to name? The questions were less dramatic now, but heavier, because they could not be resolved by verdicts or sentences. The absence of a body returned as a kind of ghost, not enough to undo what had been proven, but enough to keep certain wounds open. Search efforts were discussed again, half-heartedly, more symbolic than hopeful. Landscapes had changed. Waterways had shifted. Construction had erased entire stretches of land. Even those closest to the truth admitted that some answers were likely gone forever, absorbed by time and terrain. The idea settled uneasily. Justice had been served without recovery, accountability without return. It was enough for the law. It was never enough for the heart. Those who had cooperated most fully with investigators lived with a different burden. Protection agreements ended. Public sympathy proved conditional. They were seen as both brave and complicit, their courage inseparable from their delay. Interviews they gave were scrutinized for tone, for sincerity, for hints of minimization. Every word was weighed against years of silence. Some retreated entirely, choosing anonymity over explanation. Others spoke repeatedly, as if repetition might transform confession into absolution. It never quite did. Within law enforcement, the case prompted changes that were subtle but lasting. Cold case units were expanded. Training emphasized behavioral analysis, the slow accumulation of inconsistencies, rather than reliance on single breakthroughs. The Florida 1993 file became required reading, a reminder that resolution often arrives not through force, but through fracture. That families, like criminal networks, can enforce silence more effectively than threats from outside. That patience, while costly, can be decisive. The media, having moved on, returned occasionally with anniversary pieces, each one softer than the last. Language shifted from shock to reflection. Words like sensational disappeared, replaced by tragic, complex, instructive. The story was no longer treated as a puzzle to be solved, but as a cautionary narrative about proximity and denial. It was harder to sell, less explosive but more honest. The woman's name appeared less often alongside cold case, and more often alongside descriptions of who she had been before everything narrowed to a single night. For the town, rituals evolved. The annual vigil transformed into a memorial walk, not focused on the crime but on awareness, on speaking up, on recognizing the early signs of control and coercion that often hide in plain sight. Attendance fluctuated, but the act itself became part of the town's identity, a way of acknowledging that forgetting is also a choice, and not always a benign one. Children who had once been shielded from the story now learned it deliberately, framed as a lesson rather than a warning whispered in fear. The convicted aged in different ways. Some expressed regret that deepened with time, letters written from confinement revealing a clarity that had been impossible when loyalty still felt mandatory. Others hardened, retreating into self-justifying narratives that cast themselves as victims of circumstance, of family dynamics they claimed they could not escape. Psychologists debated these reactions publicly, analyzing them as examples of moral injury and delayed accountability. For the public, the explanations mattered less than the reality. Lives had been permanently altered, and no amount of insight could undo that. Occasionally, a rumor surfaced, suggesting that a location had been remembered, that someone had hinted at a final detail never shared in court. Investigators evaluated each one carefully, aware of how desperation can generate false hope. Searches were conducted discreetly, results kept quiet unless confirmed. Most led nowhere. Each disappointment reinforced a hard truth the case had been teaching for years. Some losses cannot be recovered, only acknowledged. As decades layered over the original crime, the story simplified in the retelling, as all stories do. Sharp edges softened, characters blurred into archetypes. Yet for those who had been closest to it, simplification felt like another kind of erasure. They resisted it, correcting details, insisting on nuance, reminding anyone who would listen that the truth had been complicated, that certainty had come at a price, and that easy narratives were part of what allowed the secret to survive in the first place. In private moments, people still wondered about the night itself, about the exact second when everything tipped from argument to catastrophe. They imagined alternate outcomes, words not said, choices not made. These imaginings were not about blame so much as longing, a universal human reflex to believe that tragedy is avoidable if only the right moment could be identified and altered. The case offered no comfort there. It suggested instead that harm often grows incrementally, unnoticed until it becomes irreversible. As the years passed, the Florida 1993 cold case stopped being referenced as a recent example and started being cited as a historical one. The distinction mattered. History implies distance, the belief that lessons have been learned, that the conditions that allowed the crime are less likely to recur. Whether that belief was justified remained an open question. What was clear was that the case had changed the town's self-perception. Innocence had been replaced by awareness. Trust had become conditional, examined rather than assumed. And beneath all of it, steady and unresolved, remained the simplest truth of the story. A woman had trusted the people closest to her. That trust had been broken in a way that reverberated across generations. No legal outcome could restore it. No explanation could fully contain it. The cold case had been solved, yes, but solving it had revealed something more disturbing than mystery. The capacity for ordinary relationships to conceal extraordinary harm, and the long shadow that concealment casts once the light finally reaches it. The final chapter of the story did not arrive as an ending, but as a settling. Not a full stop, but a slow exhale after years of holding breath. By then, the Florida 1993 cold case had become something larger than the crime itself, larger even than the family secret that finally cracked it open. It had become a lesson written into the bones of a town, into the habits of people who learned too late how quietly catastrophe can grow. Time moved forward as it always does, indifferent to verdicts and memories. New businesses opened where old ones had failed. Children who were not yet born when the woman vanished now drove the same roads, walked the same sidewalks, unaware at first of the history beneath their feet. But awareness has a way of seeping in. Someone always tells the story. A teacher mentions it in passing. A parent answers a question too carefully. And gradually the outlines form. A disappearance. Years of silence. A truth that came from inside the house, not outside it. What lingered most was not the violence, but the restraint. The knowledge that what destroyed a life did not explode outward, but folded inward, contained by people who believed they were preventing something worse. That belief haunted the community more than the act itself, because it forced an uncomfortable recognition that the line between protection and harm is not always loud, not always obvious, and not always crossed by strangers. For the woman at the center of it all, remembrance finally shifted from speculation to presence. Her name appeared on a small plaque at a local park, simple, unadorned. No mention of the case. No dates beyond her birth. Just a name and a space to sit. People stopped there without ceremony. Some left flowers. Some didn't. Some just stood for a moment, letting the silence say what words could not. It was not justice. It was acknowledgement. And sometimes that is the closest thing left. Within the family, the secret was gone, but the damage remained. Relationships that had been built on shared silence could not survive shared truth. Some members never spoke again. Others tried, failed, tried again. Forgiveness was discussed often, usually by people who did not have to grant it. Those who carried the most guilt learned that confession does not erase consequence. It only changes its shape. Freedom, when it came, was incomplete. Accountability, when it arrived, was late and heavy. Law enforcement moved on, but not without residue. Younger detectives learned the case as a cautionary tale, not about technique, but about patience and proximity. About how the most dangerous assumption is believing you know where danger comes from. About how cold cases are not frozen moments in time, but living things shaped by human endurance and human weakness. The Florida 1993 file remained on shelves, closed but not forgotten, its lessons folded into training rooms and quiet conversations. The town itself carried forward altered. Trust became more deliberate. Privacy was still valued but no longer unquestioned. People learned to listen differently, to notice the pauses, the rehearsed answers, the way some stories never quite change because they were never quite true. It did not make the town safer in any absolute sense. It made it more awake. And that perhaps was the final consequence of the case. Not closure. Not peace. But awareness. The understanding that evil does not always announce itself, that it can wear the face of routine and speak in the language of care. That loyalty, when twisted by fear, can become a weapon. And that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, is never neutral. Years later, when people spoke about the case, they no longer asked how it happened. They asked how it lasted so long. The answer was never simple. It lived in moments of hesitation, in decisions made to avoid discomfort, in the belief that keeping a family intact mattered more than confronting the truth. Those choices, multiplied over time, built a prison without walls, one that held an entire community in its shadow. The Florida 1993 cold case was solved, officially, irrevocably, but its real ending was quieter. It lived on in the way people chose honesty over harmony, questions over certainty, courage over convenience. It lived on as a reminder that secrets demand loyalty, but truth only demands time. And time, relentless and patient, always collects what it is owed. Some nights when the air grows heavy and the streets fall silent, the story returns not as fear but as memory. A life interrupted, a family undone, a town forced to look inward. The mystery is gone, but the echo remains steady and unavoidable, asking the only question that ever truly mattered, long after the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied. How many truths are we willing to bury to protect ourselves, and how long do we believe they will stay buried, before they rise, as they always do, and ask to be heard? What remained after everything else had settled was not resolution, but responsibility. The kind that lingers long after files are closed and names are archived. The Florida 1993 cold case had become a fixed point in time, yet its influence kept moving, threading itself into decisions people made without realizing why. Parents hesitated before dismissing a child's fear. Friends paused before excusing behavior that felt wrong but familiar. Silence, once reflexive, became suspect. The story continued to surface in unexpected places. Training seminars, university lectures, late-night radio segments that revisited old cases not for shock, but for warning. Analysts spoke about proximity bias, about how danger is often discounted when it comes wrapped in routine and kinship. They spoke about how communities protect themselves by denying the unthinkable, and how denial, sustained long enough, becomes infrastructure. The Florida case was no longer exceptional. It was instructive. Every few years, a journalist would try to revisit it, hoping to uncover something new, some final revelation that would justify reopening the wound. They rarely found one. Those closest to the truth had already said what they could. What they hadn't said was either forgotten, deliberately withheld, or lost to time. The absence of those final details became part of the narrative itself, A reminder that truth is not always complete, only sufficient. The law had taken what it needed. Memory carried the rest. The park where the plaque stood grew around it. Trees matured. Benches were replaced. Children played nearby, their laughter cutting through the weight of history with unintentional mercy. Some parents avoided the plaque. Others pointed it out deliberately, explaining only that it was there to remember someone who mattered. No crime. No warning. Just remembrance. The restraint felt right. The story had taken enough. For the few who still carried direct knowledge of that night, life became a long negotiation with memory. Some dreamed of it, scenes replaying with small variations, imagined alternatives where a different word changed everything. Others avoided thinking about it altogether, building routines so rigid there was no room for reflection. Neither approach offered peace. Time softened the edges, but it did not erase the imprint. It never does. The cold case units that studied the file learned something quieter than technique. They learned that truth often waits for fracture, not force. That families can become systems, and systems resist disruption until the cost of cohesion exceeds the cost of collapse. That loyalty is not inherently virtuous, and that love, when weaponized by fear, can be devastatingly effective. These lessons did not appear in headlines. They lived in margins, in annotations, in conversations held after everyone else had gone home. The town years on stopped being known for the case. New stories replaced it. New scandals. New triumphs. But beneath the surface, a subtle shift endured. People asked more questions. They trusted but verified. They understood that harmony without honesty is fragile, and that peace maintained by silence is temporary. The case had taught them that reckoning delayed is reckoning multiplied. And so the Florida 1993 cold case receded into the background of daily life, not forgotten but integrated. A scar rather than an open wound. It no longer demanded attention. It offered perspective. It stood as proof that time does not forgive, it reveals. That secrets do not dissolve, they accumulate interest. That truth, however late, changes the shape of everything it touches. In the end, the story did not belong to the courts or the police, or even the family at its center. It belonged to the quiet moments when people chose whether to speak or stay silent. To the instant when discomfort competes with convenience. To the recognition that some truths are heavy, but carrying them alone is heavier. The voice of the case faded from broadcasts and articles, but its echo persisted, not as noise but as awareness. A steady, unignorable reminder that unresolved harm does not disappear. It waits. It watches. And when it finally surfaces, it does not ask for permission to be known. That was the true legacy of the Florida 1993 cold case. Not the arrests, not the sentences, but the understanding, earned painfully and too late, that the most dangerous secrets are the ones we convince ourselves are necessary, and that no matter how long they are buried, they always remember the way back to the light. There was no ceremony marking the final distance between the case and the present. No announcement that it had fully passed into history. It simply slipped further away, year by year, like a tide receding without drama, leaving behind patterns in the sand that only some people knew how to read. The Florida 1993 cold case no longer dominated memory, but it shaped it, quietly influencing how the town understood itself and how it understood the cost of not looking too closely. In private, people still traced the long arc of the story, from disappearance to confession, from denial to exposure. What struck them most, in retrospect, was not how elaborate the deception had been, but how ordinary it was. No master plan. No criminal genius. Just a sequence of small decisions made to avoid immediate pain, each one easier than the last, until the weight of them became unmanageable. The realization unsettled those who thought monsters always announced themselves. This one had blended in, sustained by familiarity and routine. The woman's name continued to surface in quieter ways. A scholarship established in her memory. A paragraph in a local history book. A line in a lecture about unresolved loss and delayed truth. Each mention stripped away a little more of the abstraction, reminding listeners that behind the theories and timelines there had been a life with momentum, interrupted not by fate, but by choice. That distinction mattered. It always had. Among those who had grown up during the years of uncertainty, the case became a reference point for adulthood. They spoke about it when discussing boundaries, when warning friends about dismissing discomfort, when trying to explain why intuition should not be ignored simply because it is inconvenient. The story had matured alongside them, shifting from fear to understanding, from spectacle to caution. It no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered correctly. The legal system, too, absorbed the lesson. In internal reviews and closed-door discussions, the case was cited as an example of how long-term silence fractures differently than immediate denial, how pressure accumulates unevenly, how the truth often emerges not at the height of investigation, but at the moment when loyalty finally collapses under its own contradictions. These insights did not change the past. They altered how future cases were approached, how patience was valued as a tactic rather than a failure. For the family at the center of it all, time brought neither absolution nor complete condemnation. It brought distance. Some members built lives far away, identities reshaped by geography and anonymity. Others stayed, rooted by a need to confront what could not be undone. Reunions, when they happened, were careful and brief, shaped by an unspoken agreement not to reopen what had already destroyed enough. The secret was gone, but its shadow remained long and familiar. Occasionally, a new generation asked the question that had once consumed everyone. How could it happen? The answers were never simple, and over time they became less specific. Stress, control, fear, the urge to protect, the inability to imagine consequences beyond the immediate moment. These explanations lacked the clarity of blame, but they carried more truth. They suggested that the line between safety and harm is not a wall, but a slope, and that people often do not realize they are sliding until they are already at the bottom. As years folded into decades, the case lost its edges. It became quieter, more reflective, less about shock and more about awareness. The headlines had done their work. The trials had done theirs. What remained was internal, a recalibration of how people weighed silence against responsibility. The town did not become immune to denial. No place ever does. But it became less comfortable with it. And that discomfort, earned at great cost, was the only lasting protection it gained. On certain anniversaries, someone would still light a candle. Not publicly. Not for attention. Just a small flame held briefly, then extinguished. A gesture acknowledging that some stories never truly end. They just stop demanding to be told aloud. The Florida 1993 cold case had reached that point, where its power lay not in retelling but in recognition. And so the voice of the case faded completely, not into silence but into something deeper. Into instinct. Into the pause before dismissal. Into the question asked when something feels wrong but familiar. It lived on there, invisible but active, shaping choices in ways no verdict ever could. That was the final truth it left behind. That the greatest danger is not what we fail to see, but what we choose not to name. And that once named, no matter how late, the truth does not just close a case. It alters the future, quietly, relentlessly, ensuring that what was once hidden will never again be so easy to ignore. By the time even the anniversaries passed without notice, the story had thinned to something almost transparent, present without demanding attention. The Florida 1993 cold case no longer lived in headlines or court transcripts. It lived in reflexes. In the way people paused before explaining away something that felt off. In the way silence, once seen as discretion, now carried weight and consequence. The case had finished telling itself, but it had not finished teaching. The town changed in ways no statistic could capture. Conversations became more careful, not guarded but intentional. People learned to ask second questions, to listen beyond the surface of rehearsed answers. Familiarity lost its immunity. Trust was still offered, but it was no longer blind. The lesson was not paranoia. It was attentiveness. A recognition that harm does not always arrive with violence, that it can grow inside routine, fed by the desire to keep things looking normal. The woman at the center of the story settled fully into memory, no longer tethered to the moment of her disappearance. People spoke of her without lowering their voices, without prefacing her name with tragedy. She became, again, someone who had lived, not just someone who had been lost. That shift mattered more than any legal outcome. It meant the case had finally released her from its grip, allowing her life to exist outside the shadow of its ending. Those who had carried the secret the longest aged quietly. Time stripped away defenses they no longer needed. Some found themselves haunted not by fear of punishment, but by the absence of fear, by the realization that what they had protected was never worth the cost. Regret, when it came, arrived late and uninvited, settling into ordinary moments, into sleepless nights, into memories triggered by nothing at all. It offered no redemption, only clarity. For investigators, the case receded into legacy. It was mentioned less often, but when it was, the room always stilled. Younger officers listened closely, sensing that this was not a story about clever police work or dramatic confession. It was a story about endurance, about letting people outlive their own certainty, about understanding that the truth does not always surface when pushed, but when the structures holding it down finally weaken. The legal system moved on as it must, absorbing the case into precedent and policy, but its deeper impact was cultural rather than procedural. It reminded everyone involved that justice is not only about outcomes, but about timing, and that timing is rarely fair. That delay can clarify, but it can also compound harm. The case sat uncomfortably in that space, resolved and unresolved at the same time. Occasionally, someone would ask whether it could have been prevented. The question never had a satisfying answer. There was no single moment to point to, no obvious fork in the road. The tragedy had grown from accumulation, from tolerance, from the belief that silence was safer than confrontation. That belief, more than any act, was what the town learned to challenge in the years that followed. As the decades deepened, the story lost its edges completely. It became a reference rather than a warning, a remembered example rather than a feared one. But it never became harmless. Its presence lingered in the shared understanding that what happened was not an anomaly, not an aberration reserved for another place or another kind of people. It was local, intimate, possible anywhere. And that understanding, uncomfortable as it was, became the case's final contribution. Not closure, not peace, but vigilance. A quiet insistence that truth deserves space, even when it threatens harmony. That discomfort is often the first signal of something that should not be ignored. That the cost of asking hard questions is almost always lower than the cost of burying their answers. The Florida 1993 cold case ended without spectacle, without a final revelation to satisfy every curiosity. It ended the way many truths do, not with resolution but with integration, folded into the collective conscience of a place that learned, painfully and slowly, what silence can hide, and what courage, even delayed, can still uncover. And somewhere between forgetting and remembering, between history and instinct, the story settled for good, no longer asking to be solved, only asking to be understood.